Good evening, viewers, and welcome to another New Australian Bulletin interview. And tonight we have another member of white nationalist royalty, Mr. Paul Fromm from Canada. Paul, like all the greats, should have his head chiselled onto the side of Canada's equivalent to Mount Rushmore. He's currently, you are with the Canadian Freedom Movement, is that right?
Yeah, I'm the director of the Canadian Association for Free Expression.
Okay. Does that have anything to do with all those truck drivers, etc.?
Sorry?
Does that have anything to do with all those truck drivers, etc., that were driving against the, protesting against the lockdowns, Trudeau's lockdowns?
Oh, yeah, yes. Well, that's all part of it. It's the lockdowns and the mandates, you know, forced masking, forced vaxxing, or forcing people to either to be vaxxed or lose their jobs. Yes, this is all part of it. We've had protests now going back to late March of 2020, and although some of the mandates have been changed or rescinded, there's still quite a bit of government restriction, and they declare. When there was a big truckers' protest in at the end of January and early February that occupied parts of downtown Ottawa and got support from right across the country, the government declared the most restrictive measure they have to limit civil rights. That was called the Emergencies Act. That replaced the old War Measures Act, and that shows you the level of panic on the part of our globalist elite, just blind panic and overreaction, of course.
And of course, we're seeing a trend following that Canadian trucker example picked up in Holland by the farmers there. And even in Italy and in Holland, they're actually, in one instance, flying the Canadian flag in acknowledgement of the origins of that particular style of protest.
Yes, that flag behind me is the old red ensign. And about 10 days ago, our Minister of Diversity, his department, get that, Minister of Diversity. Yeah. Well, he's pretty diverse. He's a Somali refugee. He came here when he was 15. Anyway, his department funded a booklet that's to the tune of a little over $250,000. It's to be used in schools, and it's to fight hate. Well, it's not a matter of fighting hate. They never mentioned radical Islam. They never mentioned radical environmentalism that involves, in some cases, terrorism. It's all basically about fighting white nationalism. And among other things, they say that flag back there, under which our soldiers fought in 2 world wars and Korea, is a hate symbol. And so there's been a huge protest against that. We had a protest outside the minister's office last Tuesday, and there have been other protests. Veterans have protested, and so on. What they're trying to do is to eliminate, as much as possible, old stock Canada. That's a term our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, we call him the trust fund kid, absolutely hates. In fact, he hates old stock Canadians. That's why Trudeau is always apologizing. He's always apologizing to some minority or another, but not for anything he's done. It's all about the past. For instance, there's been a huge issue for several years about the so-called residential schools. And that was a program begun in 1880 by the Dominion government and carried on up until the late 70s, on and off. And it was an effort to try to educate the native Indians. See, now this didn't occur everywhere in Canada, but in some parts, particularly in the West, the native Indians were basically nomadic. And the Dominion government thought, well, how do we help these people move from the Stone Age, let's say, to the edge of the modern age? So they would gather the children together in residential schools, or like boarding schools, for about 9 months of the year, and they taught them the basics of reading, English, reading, writing, a bit of shop, a bit of home ec, a little bit of history, and religion. Most of these places were run by religious orders. Well, that has become an incredible source of outrage. It was trying to destroy their culture. There were cases of sexual misconduct and maybe brutality. Yeah, I'm sure there were occasionally. But the government, several governments have apologized for this, endless apologies, and huge compensation. So the taxpayer was in the unenviable position of having paid once to educate the Indians and paid a second time for having educated the Indians. About 10 years ago, the program was unveiled. So if you had spent 1 day in a residential school, that was good for $10,000. And then you got $3,000 for each additional year you spent. So if you were there for 9 years, you were good for about $27,000. There was never, you never had to prove anything about abuse or anything like that. So the taxpayer paid to educate the Indians some generation or 2 or 3 ago, and then paid them again because we had educated them. And then there's all along the way all sorts of more apologies. Now, the Prime Minister is always apologizing, but never for anything he's done. It's always a way to denigrate traditional Canada. And I'm absolutely convinced this has a lot to do with immigration, because there is a policy to use immigration to replace the European founding settler people here, as in Australia and the United States and most of Britain, most of Europe. Then there's no doubt about it. In 1961, when the year John F. Kennedy was inaugurated president of the United States, 61 years ago, Canada was something like 98% white. The only non-white elements being maybe 750,000 Indians, Eskimos, and so on, and a very tiny number of Orientals, East Indians, and blacks. Well, now we're 78% white and falling, and the demographers indicate that by 2050, or a bit before, the European founding settler people will be a minority. And that's accomplished entirely through massive third world immigration. For the last 40 years, we've had very, very high numbers of third world immigrants, very high levels of immigration, 85% of each year's intake from the third world. So it's replacement by demography. I'm sorry, but demographic replacement by immigration. And I think this psychological warfare on traditional Canada is part and parcel of this, because why would you want to preserve what was clearly so rotten? I mean, that's the way they would put it. They're always apologizing for something. In fact, just this last weekend, the Prime Minister was in Nova Scotia to apologize to the descendants of the, I think it was number 3 battalion, which were all blacks, and they were like a construction battalion. And the boo-hoo-hoo was there'd been a lot of discrimination against blacks in the First World War. There weren't very many, for one thing, but recruiters would generally not accept them. I thought, well, wait a sec. But there were nearly 700 members of this battalion. Of course, they were accepted. They might not have been accepted for regular military roles, but they were accepted for this. So anyway, there's an apology. I mean, I don't know what any rational person would apologize for. And morally speaking, I don't have a right to apologize for something you've done. Morally, I may have an obligation, or I may have a right to apologize for something I did, but I can't apologize for what you did. But Trudeau is a master at apologizing for things that the old Canada did. In fact, not so long ago, and I could see this coming. He issued a groveling apology for the St. Louis. The St. Louis was a famous boat. I think they even made a movie about it, that took off from, set sail from, I believe it was the Netherlands in the spring of 1939, loaded with about 700 European Jews, wealthy European Jews. Well, they thought they had a deal with Cuba, the corrupt government of Cuba, to take them. But at the last minute, enough people in Cuba found out what was happening, and they said, no way, Jose. So I think they went to the Dominican Republic and dumped some off. They then went to the United States, and despite the fact Roosevelt's administration was very, very heavily infiltrated by Jewish interests, America said no. So they chugged on up the Atlantic coast to Canada. And our prime minister of the day was something of an odd duck. He communicated with his dead mother and his dog, but he was in many ways a shrewd politician. So he asked his deputy minister of immigration, a real patriot named Frederick Blair, what should I do about this? Well, don't forget, Canada, it's 1939. Canada has unemployment of over 20%.
What did he do about it?
So Blair went to the chief Liberal party person in Quebec, and he said, well, what do the French Canadians think about this? Well, they'd had bad experience with Jews. They said, no way. He consulted members of Parliament from English Canada. Well, they said no way. So finally, Prime Minister Mackenzie King asked Blair, well, how many should we take? But Blair said, Mr. Prime Minister, none is too many. So we didn't take any. We sent them back to well, we didn't send them anywhere. We just said, you can't land. But, well, that has been a source of just guilt and outrage and so on for nearly 20 years, since the former head of the Canadian Jewish Congress, Irving Abella, brought out a book and its title was "None is Too Many." But there's no reason to apologize. We had 20% unemployment. The Prime Minister, as quirky as he might have been in those days, really put Canada and Canadians first. He said, "No, I mean, sorry, you don't like it in Europe, fine." Well, the way the story is often presented is, Canada didn't let them in, so they went right to the gas chambers. Well, no, that's not what happened. About 2/3 of them survived the war. Some died, and it's not clear. Okay, some died of old age, some died of illness, and maybe some did die in the detention camps. But the guilt mongering boo-hoo-hoo story is that hard-hearted, racist, anti-Semitic Canada turned them away, and off to the gas chambers they went. It's all bullshit. Well, anyway, he apologized for that. But that's what he does. So well, incrementally, if you didn't know your history, you would get the impression there's nothing good about the old Canada. We were terrible, so why would you want to preserve it? Anyway, that's the psychological warfare we're involved in.
Well, I'll now introduce Dr. Jim Saleam, who you've met, head of the Australia First Party, and I'm sure there's something you want to ask Paul.
But in Australia's case, it was actually Australian Jewish opinion that said that the people who were coming from Eastern Europe were not desirable migrants. They actually gave Jewish people a bad name. They didn't want them here. So it's one of those things where, to me, they're choosing propaganda, sometimes groups favouring the human rights industry and whatnot for their own advantage.
The Jewish lobby back in 1939 was not nearly as powerful as it is today. Many of those Jews had only been in Canada for under 20 years. They hadn't developed the strength that they had today, but they lobbied pretty vigorously, and of course they managed to attract a certain number of fellow travelers, some Christian churches, etc. But in 1939, a Canada First approach prevailed, but it's being used as a source of reproach and guilt, at least for the last 20 or 30 years. Part of the tirade of denigration that is aimed at traditional Canada. Just horrible, racist, and anti-Semitic, and unfeeling, and hard-hearted, and boring, and
it seems, as you'd remember from our conversations many years ago, Australia and Canada have very parallel attitudes from officialdom towards immigration. Our immigration policy was changed, as you pointed out, at a certain time. There were powerful lobby forces that argued for this change. And ever since then, any idea of Australian identity has been denigrated. And in Australia's case, there's a very false propaganda that's also constructed around our Aboriginal population.
Yes.
And Europeans are held responsible for horrendous crimes and so on and so forth. But one very interesting thing, and I don't know if this is a parallel with Canada, but any Aboriginal person I've ever met has never been friendly to the idea of refugee immigration or immigration to Australia from Asia or such like. I've heard comments from Aboriginal persons about other ethnic groups that you'd regard as racism if you're in the Human Rights Commission. Essentially, this minority of people was never asked over United Nations declarations on refugees. They were never asked or consulted by the Australian governments on immigration levels. I don't think anyone dares. And yet, when they open up Parliament, they have a fake mantra of honouring Aboriginal elders and so on, and respecting the land. But at the same time, they intend virtually to cleanse them in favour of third world migration. I must ask you, is that the same in Canada? Is that the same logic you're seeing?
Well, it's the same policy of replacement, and some of the Indian leaders are perceptive about that. There was one who got into a lot of trouble with the government some years ago, Chief David Ahenekyu. And he was openly very critical of third world immigration. That's not why he got into trouble. He got into trouble because of some thoughtless remarks he made about Jews in World War II, and all hell broke loose. Ahenekyu was basically anti-white, and for years he was the chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and he did a lot for the Indian people. and he would regularly make fairly anti-white comments, and the press loved it. Isn't the chief, in fine form today, and so on. Well, then about 15 years ago, he thought he was in a private conversation with a reporter, and the reporter Henneque was recounting some of his experiences. He was in the Canadian Army, and he'd been in Germany in the 1960s, and he said something to the effect that what he was told is that Hitler had to fry those Jews because they controlled everything. Now, I don't think it's historically exactly accurate that they didn't control everything, but it's what I call bar talk. In a bar, you often make statements in a very broad way. All Americans are, this or that, or all Brits are arrogant, or I mean, this is not scholarly talk or whatever. Well, all hell broke loose, and poor old Henneque was abandoned, although he'd done a great deal for the Indians. The Indian leadership was told, if you don't drop him, all these big fat grants that you get are going to stop. So he was isolated, and only a small number of white people, his own small band, and the great Canadian free speech lawyer Doug Christie defended him. And long story, but in the end, he won on appeal. But Henneque could see that Indians were treated far better by guilty European whites than they would ever be by, let's say, if the new majority in Canada is to, let's say, Chinese, or some concoction of Muslims. They will not be, the native Indians will not be treated well at all. For instance, one of their big thing is these days is, well, they were this is their land. They even call it Turtle Island, and somehow it was taken. It actually wasn't taken. In most cases, it was purchased, but or ceded by treaty. And they're entitled to all these special privileges and special subsidies and so on. I can see that a hard-nosed Chinese-dominated government is going to say, well, no, that was all between you and the Europeans. We're in charge now, and you'll be treated the same as anybody else. No more special privileges, no more special handouts. And the smart ones can see that. Any of the people being brought into Canada are not going to be susceptible to the guilt mongering that our leaders use to get us to agree. Well, actually, to justify all sorts of handouts and apologies and so on. That just isn't going to happen. Smart Indian leaders know that. They've never had it so good as they have it now. But they don't speak a lot about immigration, unfortunately, because their voice would be helpful.
You were talking about the Christian schools before, but there's an infamous incident that's been exposed as a fraud. Kamloops, Indian.
Yeah, that was the native band. The band out there claimed that they had found, I think it was 216 or 18 unmarked graves near the residential school that had been there. Now it was closed in about 1970, I think. A reasonable person would say, well, why did it fall into disuse? It was on your land. Why wouldn't you keep the graves up? But anyway, what has been found is some disturbance That's not being excavated, so it's not even sure there are 218 graves. But even if there are, well, actually, the media reported it as a mass grave, and you got the impression of a pit dug and bodies tossed in and covered over, probably because they'd been murdered. In fact, whatever graveyard there is would reflect about 80 years of use, and the implication has always been that these if there are Indian children there, that they were somehow abused or mistreated. First of all, it's not being properly excavated, so we don't know indeed what is there. But even if there are 218 bodies, that's not unusual for a school in operation for almost a century. And we do know that there were repeated severe flus that went through the communities and would have killed a lot of people. Canada was a nation of about 8 million people in 1918, 1919, and we lost 50,000 people from the Spanish flu. Only about 10,000 fewer than died on the battlefield in World War I. The Spanish flu was an immense killer, and I have no doubt that a fair number of those children would have died, but not because they were murdered or abused, but from the flu. But that became just a point of irrationality. That the media made it quite clear that it was white society and the residential schools that were responsible for this, with no proof. I mean, no further analysis. And in June of 2021, over 50 Christian churches were either burned to the ground or severely vandalized. And irrational, like in some case, one was a Coptic church in Vancouver. Now, the Copts had come within the last 30 years. They had nothing to do with the residential schools. But they're Christian, that's enough. There was an attempt at arson, and then that didn't succeed, but the police took it so lightly that whoever did it came back a week or so later and did succeed in burning the church to the ground. There has not been a single arrest for any of these attacks on Christian churches. The Prime Minister, very reluctantly, about 6 weeks later, said, "Well, sorry, well, he couldn't approve of it, but he understood." What do you mean you understand? You know, this is the moral poverty or depravity of much of our globalist elite. He could understand what? Burning down Christian churches because of residential schools, which actually educated the native students. It's not at all clear. Well, because no arrests are being made.
According to the New York Post, as of May 27th this year, it says that there's no actual proof of remains in the ground. They haven't actually excavated it.
No.
Nothing has been taken out of the ground so far, according to a Tekelups, I can't pronounce that Indian name, spokesman, but it's obviously some concerned tribal member. So you've got a hoax or something that was completely misapprehended, and the following destruction of the churches was tacitly given approval by the authorities.
Yeah, the fact that nobody has been apprehended. Now, as inept as the police might be, that's hard to believe. It's not unusual to have the hate squad of a police force investigate if some kid takes a magic marker and draws a swastika on a bus stop. Yes, in a more sensible society, it's nothing more than juvenile heavy vandalism. But well, they'll investigate it. We've got such a politically correct, pseudo dictatorship. Police wasting their time on that, but apparently having trouble getting around to actual arson.
Well, this is a question I could put to both of you. Obviously, there's no end to following around these liberal atrocities and these deficiencies of logic and reason that go into these liberal movements. At what point do you just stop trying to present reason in response to them and just stand up and say, no, not anymore? No, Black Lives Matter. No, a woman is a woman. No, children do not belong at drag shows. We cannot become like the Conservatives have, who just allow themselves to get moved further and further to the left with a sort of appeasement of this this scourge, which is clearly a globalist agenda, and we know it is because Davos has said as much, and yet we find ourselves just running around in circles chasing after the latest bit of liberal nonsense. Jim?
Well, look, Australia is absolutely blessed with all of that. The fact is that not a day goes by without some outrage being put forward by liberal society, one form or another. I think there is an increasing resistance amongst people. I think it started in different ways, denigrated by the media in every way. For argument's sake, on one of those points, Australian women protested at the presence of so-called transgender women in female competition. That spread to the whole sports arena, so to speak. Also with discussions of Aboriginal issues. We found a lot of Aboriginal spokesmen coming forward and pointing that the real issues are the destruction of Aboriginal lives inside the communities by alcohol, by drugs, by sexual crime. All of this liberal chatter about voices in the Constitution and so forth doesn't actually change the ways in which Aborigines live. There's a lot of signs that there are people who are resisting. When we had the lockdowns in Australia, the media went to town, of course, talking about, and there were some rather silly people talking about the vaccines. A lot of nonsense got sprouted. A lot of truth got told too. The media doesn't talk about that. But when mass workers' protests broke out on the streets of Melbourne, I don't know if Paul saw that, and a large, energetic, I won't use the word mob, that's the media word, I'll say crowd, of workers actually stormed the office of a notorious trade union that was attempting to stand over workers on all of these issues. The media realised that they couldn't put it on white supremacists, they couldn't put it on conspiracy theorists, because they were dealing with a huge mass of ordinary people. That seems to be the Australian case now. There is an awareness across the board that we're being, if you like, shuffled like sheep into the pen. So I don't know what the situation is in Canada. I'd love to hear it.
Well, yeah, there's a phenomenon that started in March of 2020. You might broadly call it a freedom movement. People, for a wide variety of reasons, questioned mandatory masking. Eventually, with the discovery or whatever of the vaccine, mandatory vaccines, or at least you'd have to have a vaccine to work in the federal civil service, as of December, to fly on an airplane, and so on. And the general intrusion into people's civil rights. And a lot of these protests, and they've gone on. I mean, even though a number of the restrictions have eased, these protests go on in most major cities every weekend, and this is unprecedented. I've been been involved in politics since the '60s, and the only thing that might even be vaguely comparable during the '60s, and then again during the '80s, the radical left, basically the communists, would put on twice yearly big marches, so-called peace marches, and they would organize and organize and organize for months for their twice yearly march. But there was nothing which would occur in most major cities, but there was nothing comparable to this every weekend, week after week, and it's brought together a very interesting group of people: white nationalists, libertarians, New Age people who are leery of traditional medicine and so on, a wide variety. And with the truckers' protest in late January and early February, they really showed their strength. There were thousands of people who came up with the trucks, and others just came up to be with them. The occupation of parts of downtown Ottawa was absolutely shocking to the elite. Now, it was more like a party atmosphere, despite the horrible cold. They had hot tubs, they had barbecues, they had, but the media, it was almost like a dirty tricks operation by, Canadian intelligence. I don't doubt it was. Before they even got to Ottawa, the party line was that they were violent, racists, misogynists, a fringe element. And the Prime Minister said that. Yeah. Anyway, they raised, through a GoFundMe, $10 million in 3 weeks in January. A woman who's now been thrown back in jail, Tamara Leach, did that. To give you some perspective, we had a federal election last September. All 6, semi-major federal parties raised less than $10 million collectively for the election. Now they've got, with all the fundraising, techniques they have, they still raised less than the truckers did. This absolutely shocked the globalist elite, and the convoys came from across Canada. But it was really interesting. The turnout of support when they would be coming through a small town or a city, people would gather. It was for most of Canada, it was freezing cold there in January, and they'd wait for hours till the trucks came by, cheered them on. If they stopped, they'd give them bundles of food and money and supplies. I've never seen an outpouring like this across Canada. It wasn't just regional. It wasn't just a faction here or there. When they rolled into Winnipeg on the prairies, a local group of Hutterite women from the Hutterite colony outside of town said, well, we will give them a big supper. So they rented an auditorium or a facility, and they brought in by trucks their food and so on. These Hutterites are great cooks. and standoffish. They're very much to themselves community. So even this gesture was unusual and interesting.
Are they indigenous people?
Pardon?
Are they indigenous people?
No, they're
religious people.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay, yeah. Never heard the term. Yeah.
So, well, the RCMP thought they would fix the truckers, so they wouldn't allow them to go through Winnipeg. So that they had to go around it. So they had to. So that, in a sense, sabotaged this reception that the Hutterite women were going to have for them. So what they did, the Hutterite women piled into pickup trucks and drove 3 hours farther east to a town in Ontario called Kenora, set up their facilities there and welcomed the truckers. Now, there are all sorts of similar incidents across Canada. The support was unprecedented, and I think this absolutely spooked the elite. They didn't know what to they tried the usual abuse, which often breaks up a movement. You say, well, don't talk to him because he's a white supremacist. So, okay, this fellow decided, oh, I better pull away from him because they've called him a bad name. That wasn't working that well anymore. The media kept braying about white supremacy and misogyny, and this is a big laugh. I've been to protests in 15 different Canadian cities, in some cases numerous times. At some of these protests, I would say 70% of the people there are women. So it's a really strange movement that's a majority women that are hate themselves. That's just not. I mean, it's just all bullshit.
Yeah, to conflate refusing to have an injection so that you can put food on the table with white racism is quite a leap, but they do it barefacedly. The question
it's one of their tried and true techniques. You call you a bad name. The other thing that I noticed, because I've been at these protests, I've been there, unlike a lot of the reporters and most of the politicians. I actually know what I'm talking about. The ferment of people asking questions, and the mass media basically has zero credibility. A whole lot of people have participated in something, then seen the way it was either completely ignored or smeared, and now the light bulb goes on. You can't trust the media, and that is a huge step down the road to enlightenment. And it's amazing the ferment, the exchange of ideas and information, and to the extent I think they have any idea of what's going on, the globalist elite are really worried.
Do you have a question, Jim?
Well, actually, very interesting. The amount of political repression that you're alluding to in Canada, we have it here. A lot of people imagine that Australia is a very free society, and traditional Australians have had a reputation for what we call larrikinism, anti-authoritarianism and whatever. But the fact of the matter is we see Australia as a very repressive place. But obviously you're painting a picture of Canada. If I can lead in, you mentioned the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, for the uninitiated. I remember when I first found out that the Mounties were a political cop force, I was astounded. And yet that seems to be what you have now.
Yes, basically political policing and a political justice system. The woman who was single-handedly responsible for raising a little over $10 million. Tamara Litch was charged for a number of what we would call Mickey Mouse charges, counseling mischief. I'm not even sure what mischief is. Public mischief is usually petty vandalism. You know, if I scrawled a dirty word with a magic marker on a property that isn't mine, that's mischief. But anyway, she was charged with a number of those counts. She was denied bail at first, eventually did get bail, which, among other things, required her not to communicate on the social media, you know, Twitter or Facebook. So what the state was doing was essentially silencing her long before the trial. And our justice system is so sclerotic. I would doubt that she'd see getting to a court for 18 months. So she appealed the bail conditions, and they were modified somewhat. And then she received a Freedom Award from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And the globalist elite were outraged. I mean, this person was a bad person. She was one of the leaders of the Trucker Freedom Convoy. She was supposed to be shunned and ostracized. Instead, she was given this award, and it's actually given in Toronto, but then there are other ceremonies for her in Calgary and Vancouver. So she was a real personality. Well, then a week ago, a little over a week ago, before a big protest on our Dominion Day, July 1st, she was the subject of a cross-Canada warrant for breach of bail conditions. The breach of her bail condition was allegedly at one of these award ceremonies. She was in the same area as another one of the organizers, and that was part of her bail condition. She was not to associate with these people. She was the subject of a cross-Canada warrant. Now, normally a cross-Canada warrant would only be issued for a murderer or, you know, serious maybe bank robbery or something like that. A Mickey Mouse offense like breach of bail conditions. So she was duly picked up. She's now in jail in Ottawa. There will be further court action further action by her lawyers to get her bail again. But we have an intensely politicized justice system.
And these issues are just strands. There's many strands. We watched the documentary "What Is a Woman" recently, and that covers the debacle that is the trans movement. And one of the stories told within that film was about a Canadian man whose daughter was against his wishes, his daughter was granted a transitioning in the hospital system, and he actually found himself arrested for not using her proper pronouns, and he's not allowed to communicate with his daughter. He's for not using her chosen pronouns, a form of address that didn't even exist 10 years ago has to be punished so hard. And you know, I've watched a lot of Canadian reality cop shows, and they seem to be a hell of a lot softer on drugs and guns and things like that are found in the hands of disreputable people. And yet a man who's looking out for his daughter is, you know, it's incredible what's happening there. We spoke to Jared Taylor recently, and Jared said all of it began with anti-whiteism. That was the door that broke it all open. Transgenderism, freedom, this all. I come to see that there's a hell of a lot in that observation. And if we want to take it further, we can take it to Ukraine. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that, Paul. What's the West's encroachment into Russian territory, and yet what were they doing? They were they were supplying and training groups like the Azov Battalion. Now, doesn't that conflict a bit with their narrative? Nazi, you're a Nazi if you don't want to get a vaccine, and yet here's some weapons for some self-described practicing Nazis. Well, what are your thoughts on the Ukraine?
Oh, well, complicated. I don't like to see white people killing white people.
Yeah.
I think if we could have learned anything from World War I and II, is that they were a disaster for us genetically.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, just on one very basic level, maybe a generation ago, I used to know a fair number of British vets of World War II, and they were immensely proud that we beat the Jerrys. And even then, I thought, okay, you beat the Jerrys, and now you've got cities in England that are overwhelmed by Muslims. Places in the north of England, you'll be awakened by the howling from the local mosque. So you beat the Germans, who were never going to invade you anyway, and run you, and look what you've got. The order that you welcomed in is basically replacing you. Maybe it would have been better if, hypothetically, the Germans had invaded and they put in I mean, it couldn't have been worse than this. At least you'd all still be Europeans. But no, about the Ukraine. So yeah, I start off with not liking to see white people kill white people. As they say about on these dating sites, it's complicated, and it is complicated. This is almost never reported, but Corruption Watch lists the Ukraine as the second most corrupt country in Europe, only behind Russia. So, anytime a figure or a regime gets almost universal approval, I get suspicious. Zelensky is not Ukrainian; he's a Jew. Yeah. Zelensky's cabinet is filled with other Jews or entertainers. He's a
comedian.
His qualifications were that he was some sort of an entertainer, a comedian. Well, you know, sure, that's okay. That's where he's obviously a great showman. He's got great communication skills, and he or his handlers are great at making sure he goes out to dangerous areas. He makes these appearances. He's off in European capitals all the time. I mean, he's a great showman, but what I see happening is very, very bad for white people. I mean, they're killing each other. Guarantees were made that were not kept. The Ukraine gave up its, I think it had the 4th or 5th largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. And after the fall of communism, there was an agreement that the West would guarantee its sovereignty if they gave up their nuclear weapons. Well, they did, and Russia has tried to get back territory that certainly in Crimea was traditionally Russian. And the West has egged on people like Zelensky
Well, they're funding. George Soros was funding the what was it? The colour.
The Maidan Revolution.
Yeah, and he did that throughout the Arab world as well, and many of those turned out very badly. Russia and the Ukraine got along well up until 2014, and as you say, the Soros money and Western agitation support has
exacerbated.
Exacerbated the tensions, and there is the Zelensky has brought a very left-wing order into the Ukraine. For instance, he's suppressed almost all of his opposition. So when people tell us we're fighting for democracy in the Ukraine, well, not really.
It's a bit odd, though, isn't it, Paul, when you get a group such as the East Europeans that have a sort of fanatical, let's call it Nazi culture, because that's how they describe themselves. What are they doing being led by a Jew?
Well, it's very ironic. And he has pushed the LGBTQ agenda, gay pride parades, and so on, which don't go down that well among most East Europeans. So he is the agent of the globalists, trying to make the Ukraine into a nice left wing.
Well, Jim,
when it comes,
there was one report that came to me today off a French website, a nationalist one in Paris, which, if true, if it can be verified, I think says absolutely everything, and it leads to what you were saying: Europeans killing Europeans. You'd remember that in the Second World War, the notorious NKVD operated an agency called blocking battalions. They placed them behind Soviet lines. If any attempted to withdraw, they were shot. And it was a ruthless way. It was a ruthless war, terrible war on both sides. Both sides committed crimes. The NKVD also committed crimes against its own population. Reports that the Russians are sprouting are that the Ukrainians are also operating these blocking battalions behind the regular Ukrainian forces. And if any Ukrainian forces attempt to withdraw, they're shot at by these people who ironically happen to be, as other commentators have said, these so-called Nazis, these Azovists and others that operate in Ukraine. They're the ones doing it. And in Mariupol during the siege, there was a lot of stuff about people being, trapped underground and all of this. But these people refused to surrender. They could have surrendered. As we know from history, for argument's sake, even the German commandant in Berlin after the death of Hitler had decided that it wasn't worth defending. It was bad enough to surrender, but it was even more evil to carry on fighting. So he surrendered the city. These people continued to fight on long past any possibility of anything and terrorised people to stay with them in captivity. They used human shields. But if these stories of blocking battalions are true, there is some evidence that Ukrainian troops have actually surrendered to the Russians. It may be that a lot of ordinary Ukrainian soldiers don't want to fight this war either. And if given an opportunity, maybe this is the thing that Zelensky and his clique fear, that the Ukrainian military, the ordinary Ukrainian patriot, has a deep love for Ukraine. He doesn't necessarily want his country to be invaded either. But maybe he might be the ultimate answer to the problem. Get rid of Zelensky and his Western clique and attempt to make peace. And that would be what I would consider a very viable outcome. But I think it's necessary to verify whether this story of Azovist blocking battalions is in fact true.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't have a simple solution, but I really feel we should be neutral.
Yeah, that's correct.
And one of the things that really bothers me is the Canadian government's on a fanatical, they're piling aboard with the sanctions. But seizing the bank accounts or property of a growing number of Russians, supposedly oligarchs, but not just oligarchs, people who have some role in the Russian government. What worries me about that is, if you don't want these people's money or investment, fine, ban them. Just say, no, just like I think we should not allow Red Chinese to invest in Canada. I don't think they should be allowed to invest in a corner store, let alone into some of the big industries they have. Fine, tell them up front, we don't want your money, you stay home. But having accepted their money, I consider theft. And they did the same thing when they brought in the Emergencies Act for, I think it was 9 days, to try to smash the Trucker Freedom Convoy. They froze over 250 bank accounts. They basically stole the people's money. They stole one of the two GoFundMe, or one of the two online funding programs. And when I say stole, they prevented the distribution to the truckers. Yeah. So what GoFundMe did was it refunded to the donors the money, but it was still stolen from the truckers. Those donors had given the money to be used for the truckers' freedom protest. The truckers didn't get it. Well, when the government can interfere with people's bank accounts like that, or interfere with that, I think that's very dangerous. And when I hear this being done, we're standing up for democracy in the Ukraine. I'd like to see
it's laughable.
Human rights here in Canada. Let the Ukrainians sort themselves out.
Well, they've done that to our Australia First Party. The bank that's
froze their bank accounts has
locked us out from our own money. Jim's had his personal account cancelled. Both of us were banned off Facebook. There's been a hell of a lot of government intrusion, and so it's hard to see these as being peculiar just to each of our countries. It's not. It's interconnected. And you'll notice if we look at the spy program that all of our countries link into, that seems to be a connecting thread, doesn't it? The Five Eyes. We've got US, Britain, Canada, and for as much as New Zealand matters anywhere, New Zealand. The next thing is hunger, right? The next thing they seem to be attacking is food. There's stories out of the US that a number of food processing plants have been burnt to the ground and have been destroyed in circumstances never expatiated on. We're being fed propaganda about eating bugs by the World Economic Forum and the benefits for humankind. What we're seeing in Holland, etc., is not anything to do with nitrogen, the use by small farmers of nitrogen. It seems to be to curb farming in general. This business that the Ukraine's impacted Western food distribution.
Well, there's some evidence, there is a tightening of food issues in the world.
Tightening?
I've got a lot of problems there.
Tightening's like a python tightens itself around a small mouse.
For argument's sake, many people pointed out that in the Indo-Pacific, the US in particular wants to defend Taiwan against China, etc. It's got an interest in computer chips and all of this. Then we find out the other day that the two main minerals that are necessary for computer chipping, neon and palladium, 90-odd% of the world's production of those minerals comes from two countries, Russia and Ukraine. And there must be linkage here. All the way along, some people argue, and I suppose they're right too, that political progress for any minority cause and the defence of traditional societies is at the moment a minority cause. takes place when regimes become unstable. Now, despite all the military posturing, the professions of a new market millennium, none of this is really eventuated. I think, speaking for some Australians at least who have been active as nationalists for many, many years, we can see that there are openings in the traffic. Do you think, Paul, there's openings in the traffic in the same way in Canada now for people who want to put Canada first?
Yes, this is a time of growing lack of faith and cynicism. As I was saying, the people that I met at these various end the lockdown protests, in many cases have experienced a tremendous growth of insight in their lives in just a few months. It's I guess what has happened is that once you realize you've been lied to by people you trusted, like the media or the politicians, on one point, you become a lot more open to questioning another point. I know somebody who's done time in jail in Germany, although he was actually born in Canada. He said, I was sort of a go along, get along liberal up until partway through the 2000s, when I started researching 9/11. And, after a period of time, he realized that the conventional narrative about 9/11 was false. And somebody said to him, oh, the next thing you know, you're going to say the Holocaust never happened. Well, he was a German. He was brought up, he was born after the war, but he was brought up as a good, guilty German in Western Canada. And say that kind of sparked his interest. Oh, really? Well, maybe if they lied about 9/11, maybe they lied about that. And anyway, that became, he became a fierce critic of the Hollywood version of World War II, and he's just gotten out of a German jail. He's just served 4 years. It's Alfred Schaefer. His intellectual growth and development parallels in some ways some of the people I met at these protests. That they weren't necessarily completely skeptical about most government pronouncements until there was something about these mandates that caused them to question. And once you start questioning, once you realize they lied to you about one thing, you're much more open to so that this is all the good stuff. The bad stuff is how so many people have lost the ability to think.
Yeah.
We were told in Canada, get the vaccine. You'll protect yourself and protect others. This is what you must do. Well, our Prime Minister, I'm sure, has got the 2 doses and the boosters. When the truckers showed up in Ottawa, he came down with a dose of COVID, which sidelined him for a week. He recently got it again. I would think, wouldn't it strike the ordinary person that here's a guy who's been vaccinated and boosted and all that. If he gets COVID twice in a 6-month period, does that mean the vaccine isn't very effective? Well, if it's not very effective, why would you force me to get it?
There's also the possibility he was lying. He just didn't want to confront the situation. But I just got over COVID, and can I say it is the weakest form of the flu I've ever had. I don't think I've had a flu weaker than that. There wasn't even a running nose. There wasn't any of this. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let them jab that glowing serum into my arm when Pfizer is free of any liability thanks to the FDA and the American government. And when you look where the money goes, from all of these companies, it looks like the biggest, forget Bernie Madoff, this is the biggest scam that's ever been perpetrated. And then you turn on the news and some healthy sportsman's dropped dead in the middle of the field and he's died suddenly. This strange, and that's now, it's a form of death apparently. Well, you know, sudden adult death syndrome. You know, I mean, have we been infantilized enough? We are living in an age where you know, it started with Edward Bernays and his orientation of the West around propaganda, but that has it's gone hyper. You know, it's led to the selfishness. It went through the 1960s and the whole concept of the me, the self, and that has just become, you know, hyper accentuated. You know, that was a comment, by the way.
Well, we do live in a society where it's supposed to all be about the individual, but at the same time, our societies have become the most conformist on earth.
Well,
and it's good, however, as Paul's pointed out, there's now this incredible number of people who are starting to break free. I think I said it before, in Australia, and start to question. It's questioning, as it would also work that way. If you question one thing, why would you then not question another and another about the society in which you live?
They have to see that the governing class is not governing. They see us as their possession, their ownership. They see us as helots.
There is a proper, if you take Karl Marx out of it, there is a proper class analysis, and it's linked to culture, it's linked to power, it's linked to other factors.
This is what we are ruled. Provoke war with Russia over. This is their democracy. That's the funniest interpretation of...
Not very democratic. And if you went into the street and asked people, do they want to be neutral, as Paul said, I'm quite sure a lot of people do. In fact, one of the great propaganda myths I've noticed, the entire democratic world is mobilising itself and it's found its soul. But if for a moment we just take all hominids on Earth and whatever, the vast majority want nothing to do with this war. And consequently, it doesn't seem to be popular. It's only popular amongst the official classes, if I can use such a term, as to what a war should be. I think there was a slogan, actually, the Germans had it in the 1950s, when there was a quite large nationalist, neutralist movement. And they said, without us. If you want to have a war, you go have one, but we just had one. We didn't come out of it very well. Without us, thank you very much. And I think that's something that a lot of patriotic people might really think about too. Without us, I don't want to be part of this. Like we Australians, Paul, we have our legitimate nationalist grievances against China, but be damned if I'd want to see my son or my grandson sent to a war to save Taiwan for a global trade system. That's an entirely different war. And that wouldn't be one I'd want to fight. I'm quite sure you'd be the same.
Well, Paul, can I just ask you, is there still fight left in the freedom movement over there? Because from the perception I have of the Canadian regime is that they've, you know how you said about the people that donated via crowdfunding for the truckers. Well, I heard they actually started going after the people that had donated. Now, is there still fight left in the
yes. These protests are continuing. And you're right, there were some people who donated that had their bank accounts frozen. There was one woman, she's a single mother, minimum wage, she gave $50 and her bank account was frozen. But that has that had a tidal wave effect when people started realizing bank accounts could be frozen and the banks couldn't be trusted. The banks are just loyal flunkies of the government. they apparently, and this was in testimony before a parliamentary committee, the run on the banks, people were just withdrawing cash, saying, well, we just can't trust the government. And that wasn't just people who'd been involved politically. People that really spooked people. I don't know what it was like in Australia, but early on in COVID, a lot of businesses wanted you to use a credit card or debit card,
yes,
not cash.
Yes.
And I saw that as a very, very dangerous trend, because he who controls the access, the credit card or debit card, I mean, it can be cancelled.
Yes,
and
it can.
Without cash, you're...
Yeah, that's been a very strong movement in Australia in government circles to restrict the use of cash. And there have been attempts to suggest that no cash payment more than $5,000 should be allowed, things along that line. And even the withdrawal of the $100 note, because it said that it assists money laundering. They want to take us back to $50 notes. So there's been a lot like that here. And I think a lot of Australians have noticed this. They might not understand what it might mean in terms of repression or societal control, but they have noticed it. It's strange. It's something they've never thought of before. And as you've said...
But the irony of that is, if you switch to what cryptocurrency was intended for, you undermine that system, you decentralise it. And that, yet again, is a cashless... is a cashless system. Well, gentlemen, we've been speaking for well over an hour now, and it's been a joy to speak to you, Paul.
So.
And I hope it's been good for you, two old comrades from across a very wide pond to catch up.
Indeed. Well, I was going to ask you, Paul, just for the benefit of the Australian listeners, are you thinking of coming back to Australia at any time to speak?
Well, if I have an invitation, I will, and if your government lets me in.
That might be a problem. And since you were here last, the great joke is I got banned from New Zealand a number of years ago, which the Kiwi friend said is truly the pits. But I'm quite sure getting a visa for you would be a little bit more difficult. But maybe in 2023, there may be something we can do along that line.
I would like that. Of course, I really like my 2 trips to Australia, and yeah, I would be very glad to come. Last time it was, well, problems were, obstacles were raised, and the 2 times I entered Australia, once the first time, and then when I went to New Zealand and came back, they gave me a hard time, but I did get to stay. So I guess it's in the hands of the gods or Allah or whoever's running
whoever it is. Well, we'll see what we can do. In fact, I think that there are a number of speakers from other countries who would like to come to Australia, have a very positive message, and I'll make sure we exchange our email addresses off air, and we'll enter into a correspondence about that. So thanks for talking to me. I know our host has been very generous in putting it on, and I look forward to speaking to you in the flesh, as they say.
Yes, and could you send me your mailing address?
Yeah, we'll do that. Yep.
But it's good to see you again. It's good to meet a new friend with Nathan. And yes, let's do this again. And I think we've sort of solved the technological problem.
Hopefully so. You never know in this world.
My usual solution to these technological problems is to get a hammer. I mean,
well, that works. The Luddites had something to commend them. Okay, well, thank you.